I invite you to be seated. So, a certain professor of theology at Virginia Theological Seminary 20 some odd years ago used to like to say to his classes, the surest sign you're a heretic is when you know you've got it all figured out. Now, maybe the word heretic is a little strong, but it got the point across, and it got us reflecting on what it means to strive after a deeper and greater understanding of God, and what it means, or whether it is possible, to have it all figured out. And we know from other experiences, not necessarily theological in our lives, that there is a certain rising trajectory of goal setting, of ambition, of humility, of awareness, when there are more things to learn and we don't have it all figured out. And then, in many situations, there can be a kind of a plateauing period when, even if we don't say to ourselves, I've got it all figured out, there is a loss of that drive, a loss of that internal sense of being spurred forward, that today is going to be better than yesterday. That today I am going to make progress in something that I have to learn. And when that plateau is reached, it can be quite contented. I've made it. I don't have to bust my backside and hustle like I need to prove myself to other people. I have reached this certain level of competence or intellectual knowledge or esteem in the eyes of my peers, and I can reap the fruits, the benefits of all of that hard work. And there's nothing untrue about that. But what we also tend to notice oftentimes when we reach that plateau is that certain things that were kept well-toned, that the muscles of our ambition start to atrophy. And it starts to become easier to take what we already have and to make assumptions that it's enough, and that maybe going that extra little distance that we might have at that earlier stage, in that more ambitious ascendant stage, that's not really necessary anymore. And it is in that plateau area that the temptations start to creep in to cut corners. Well, it doesn't really matter if I have absolute integrity about this thing that I'm doing right now, because after all, nobody really does. It doesn't really matter if I go all out and do the very best of my ability, because look at that guy down the street. I mean, boy, that's embarrassing. I'm 10 times better than he is, even when I just show up on a normal day. And these kinds of corner-cutting seductions start coming in when we are no longer looking higher to where we can go, but instead looking straight across at where we've already gotten to. And I think that's what's happening this morning with this Pharisee. And speaking of cutting corners, the Gospels cut corners in the sense of using that term Pharisee almost in every instance as someone who is not striving in the utmost way towards a fully vital relationship with God, is kind of taking the status and the privilege that they already have culturally and from their learning and using that for their own advantage. And these are often portrayed as opponents of Jesus. So it's not a surprise that the Pharisee is cast in a negative light in this. But I wanted to call extra attention to his confidence. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. Give 1/10 of all my income. Boy, that's a really tempting opening during pledge campaign for a priest. It's not going to be the main point of where I'm going this morning. However, if he was to compare himself in those two things, I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all my income, what percentile do you think that would put a person in, just objectively speaking, in terms of those two categories of religious practice? I'm thinking pretty high. And if we were to think about that in our current time, where would that put a person who, maybe not fasting, but some kind of regular habit or discipline of personal piety, and then 1/10 of all their income? What do you think? The top 1%? The top 1/10 of 1% in terms of devotion? Things are more casual in our present climate. And so those two things are laudable. He is expressing a commitment to doing things that are recommended and praiseworthy in terms of religious practice, in terms of religious devotion. Now the question is, why? Why is he doing those things? And this is where Jesus takes issue. This is the nut of the parable. Because if your devotion is intended to be on that ascendant slope, I want to go into a place of deeper relationship with God. I want to commune with God to the utmost of my ability and use these practices of personal piety and financial generosity as vehicles, as means to be able to enjoy that relationship. Then why would you turn them around instead as badges of superiority? Doesn't seem like it quite squares. The one who is looking to use whatever means are available to her in her pursuit of the life of faith, and understands that the character of God is one of unconditional love towards all people, it seems incongruent that then you would take those practices as markers for criticizing or putting down another person. And so something went askew. Something which was in the beginning almost certainly an attitude of admirable striving and faith got twisted into an attitude of smugness and superiority. And when that twist happens, it is hardly ever noticeable. We have a hair trigger sensitivity about such smugness in other people. Oh, that arrogant so-and-so. Can you believe? And you know what they do? Let me tell you, when nobody's looking, blah, 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 blah. We got that radar locked in when it comes to other people's hypocrisy. But when it comes to our own selves, it's harder to see. And so this guy, who I will choose to give the benefit of the doubt to, probably doesn't even realize that that shift has taken place. Because it is easier to look at the objective what's than to go into an honest self-reflection about the subjective whys. The objective what's are still admirable. You fast twice a week and you give 1/10 of your income. How can that be criticized? That's great. But why are you doing it? Is it so that you can stand in conversation with God and go, I'm all that. Yeah. Yeah. Look at me. And is God impressed by that? And sometimes I think that's really the place in which we profit from going to in the consideration of our own faith. We are more or less impressive in each other's eyes, and it is natural for us to look at other people and see the things that they project and see, in many cases, how those projections appear impressive. But in God's eyes, it just doesn't matter. What would be impressive, what would be lovable in God's eyes about our practice of faith? And that's really the only opinion that should matter. What the neighbor thinks, it doesn't matter. What the priest thinks, really doesn't matter. What your best friend thinks, it matters. But in comparison to the person whom we are practicing faith with, it doesn't really matter. And so when Jesus says at the end, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, all who humble themselves will be exalted, what I take away from that is all who get to the plateau and get complacent and take their eyes off of the one who has gifted us with life and calls us into a blessed relationship for eternity, when we get to that place, that's when we start to fall. That's when we start to lose sight. But for all who recognize there's something that lay before me that I can keep striving for all who keep themselves on that ascendant path throughout the entire journey of life, for all who are able to recognize there's an aspect of my faith, there's a practice of faith that I can still go farther in. That's where humility comes from. The day that you think you've got it all figured out is the surest sign you're a heretic, or maybe even at least the surest sign that you've lost your edge, that you've lost the ascent, that you've lost the hunger for being able to experience another dimension of the infinite immensity of God. The joy of pursuing the life of faith is that we can never get to the end. And maybe that's frustrating for a perfectionist. Maybe that's frustrating for the one who wants to master the skill so that they can get the trophy or some other accolade. But in the larger context of relationship, it is an ever truth. You can never get to the end of a relationship. You can never stop discovering things about another person and by extension about God that are not a joy. And so the practices are good. I encourage you to reflect on what your own personal devotional habits are. If you don't fast twice a week, okay. What do you do? And why is that important to you? If you don't give 1/10 of your income, okay. What do you give? And why is that important to you? And what difference does that make? It is those whys that keep us on the ascent, that keep us in pursuit, that keep us having that edge of growth. So the other person uses language that is somewhat crude. Crude's not the right word. Quite humble, at least. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. If that works for you, fine. It's not the language that I would use. But it doesn't matter what language I would use. And for you, it doesn't matter what language he would use. And for him, it doesn't matter what language you would use. What matters is the language that reaches out in connection, seeking intimacy with God. That's where we get our exaltation. And it's not because we're great. It's because God is great and good all the time and continues consistently to beckon us towards God. So may you discover something this week that is a source of joy because of your pursuit. May you have a reflection of something this week that may have hit a plateau that you want to start a new ascent on. May this contrast of these two characters spur in you a reflection about who am I in this story and in relationship to other people around me, and who do I really want to be in relationship with God. Amen.
Amen.